By the time the sun went down, everyone in Ash Creek, Ohio, knew the boys were missing. The sheriff organized search parties before darkness settled over the woods. Neighbors searched along the creek while fathers checked abandoned barns and empty fields. Mothers waited on front porches, hoping to hear 3 bicycles rattling up the gravel road. They searched until midnight. They searched again at first light. For nearly 6 weeks, the people of Ash Creek searched every place they could imagine 3 adventurous boys might have gone. They never found a single clue. There was no way they could have. Tommy Callahan, Ray Siciliano, and Eddie Parker were already 39 years into the future. My name is Peter Hale, and I've served as a time travel agent with the Outer Agency for nearly 3 decades. The agency is headquartered on Arcturus. Our responsibility is to protect the integrity of Earth's timeline. But when a temporal rift changes the future in a way that cannot be tolerated, then we absolutely must. Most of our work passes unnoticed, exactly as it should. When history unfolds as it was meant to, no one ever realizes we were there. This mission began the way most of ours do. It began with an interruption. I was having lunch in the agency cafeteria with another field agent. It was Salvador Dali, actually. History remembers him as one of the greatest artists who ever lived. I know him as an even better time traveler. He was halfway through explaining why perspective was overrated when my tablet vibrated. I glanced down. One line appeared on the screen. Temporal disturbance detected. Report to the briefing hall immediately. Salvador read the message over my shoulder and smiled. I suppose lunch is over. I'm afraid so. Leaning back in his chair, he twisted the ends of his mustache and replied, "Try not to alter civilization before dessert." "I'll do my absolute best." I tucked the tablet under my arm and left the cafeteria. The briefing hall sat near the center of the agency. Every field mission began there. By the time I arrived, Director Sarin, Graham McKay, and Ayanna Redbird were already inside. The projection table stood in the center of the room. I slipped into my usual chair and the doors gently closed with a soft hiss. Director Sarin stood beside the projection table, his hands clasped behind his back. Only then did he speak. "Good afternoon. A temporal disturbance has been detected on Earth in the year 1940. He rested one hand on the projection table as a circle of pale blue light spread across its surface. Then an image appeared above it. At first it was indistinct. Slowly it sharpened. A country road, trees, and a creek. It looked less like a recording and more like a window. The disturbance began here. The image widened. 3 bicycles came into view. We turned our attention to the projection. 3 boys were racing down a dusty country road. Before the day was over, they would disappear without a trace. We watched as Tommy Callahan hit the cracked concrete slab first. His front tire bounced just high enough off the broken edge for Tommy to believe he'd left the ground. He landed with a grin. "You boys see that?" Ray Siciliano never even looked up. "Yeah, I saw it. It was about 2 inches. It was a foot." Ray just shook his head and said, "It wasn't even a good 2 inches. Beside me, Graham smiled. "I like him already." Tommy looked back over his shoulder. "You're just sore because you can't do it." Without another word, Ray stood on his pedals and lined himself up with the cracked slab. "I'll show you what I'm capable of." Tommy laughed. "Don't chicken out now." Ray hit the concrete. Both wheels stayed firmly on the ground. Tommy doubled over laughing. "You got less air than I did." Ray couldn't help grinning. I wasn't really trying yet. A moment later, Eddie Parker caught up to them. "That's what you said yesterday, Ray." The 3 boys laughed and pedaled on. 100 yards farther down the road, Ray glanced toward the creek sparkling through the trees. "Anybody up for skipping rocks?" Tommy looked at him as though he'd asked the easiest question in the world. "You kidding?" He reached into his pocket and rattled something. "I always carry rocks." Ray finally turned to look at him. "You carry rocks around?" Tommy pulled one shoulder up. "Just the really good ones." "There are good ones?" "There are if you know what you're looking for." Eddie only shook his head. "He's telling the truth. He's always got rocks in his pockets." Tommy pulled one out and held it up. It was flat and smooth, almost perfectly round. Ray studied it for a moment before giving a reluctant nod. "I'll admit, that's a pretty good rock." Tommy smiled, clearly pleased with himself. "I know where to find him." "Where at?" Tommy's grin widened. "I'm not telling you." Ray groaned. "Oh, come on. No way I'm telling. But we're best friends." Tommy answered without missing a beat. "Exactly. So you've got a secret rock place?" Slipping the stone back into his pocket, Tommy simply smiled. "If I told you, it wouldn't be secret anymore." Beside me, Graham chuckled. "I've met grown men less protective of gold." Ayana watched the boys for another moment before smiling. "They're only 12 years old. To them, those rocks are gold." Ray pointed toward the creek. "If either one of you thinks you're going to beat me to that creek, you've got another thing coming." Before he'd finished speaking, Tommy was already standing on his pedals. "You're on." The three boys raced toward the creek, laughing all the way. Tommy pulled slightly ahead. "I get first throw." Ray pedaled harder. "Only if you beat us there." Eddie pedaled until he drew even with Tommy and Ray. "You two know damn well I skip rocks better than either of you," Eddie said. Tommy laughed. "Since when?" "Since always," Eddie answered. Ray smiled. "I hate to admit it, Tommy, but Eddie might be right." Tommy looked at Ray. "Whose side are you on?" "The side that's going to beat you," Ray replied. Tommy shook his head. "I need better friends." Eddie smiled at that. "You couldn't find better friends if you tried." Ray nodded. "He's got you there." Tommy sighed dramatically. "I hate it when you two gang up on me." The boys kept pedaling and laughing all the way. As the road curved around the creek, each boy was forced to come to a screeching halt by the appearance of something they couldn't begin to understand. There, beside the creek, completely out of place and out of time, sat a bright red 1979 London bus. In the summer of 1940, these kids had never seen anything remotely like it. It wasn't simply that the machine was enormous. It looked as though it belonged to another world. Tommy was the first to find his voice. "What in the world is that?" Tommy asked. Ray never took his eyes off the towering red machine. "I don't know." Eddie stared at it for another moment. "What do you suppose it is?" Tommy swung one leg off his bicycle. "It sure ain't from around here." He let his bicycle fall where he stood. Ray climbed off his bicycle and dropped his beside Tommy's. Eddie stepped off his bicycle and let his fall across the other two. The three boys stood in silence. Tommy finally took a cautious step toward the strange machine. Eddie reached out and caught Tommy by the sleeve. "I wouldn't touch it." Tommy looked back at Eddie. "Why not?" Eddie nodded toward the strange machine. "'Cause we don't know what it is." Tommy looked back at the towering red machine. "That's exactly why I want to." For a long moment, the only sound was the creek moving quietly beside them. The bus didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It simply sat there. Tommy took another cautious step. Ray and Eddie followed close behind. The three boys slowly closed the distance. Then a sharp hiss shattered the silence. All three boys jumped. A folding door swung open. A man in a dark blue uniform stepped down onto the creek bank. He looked at the boys and the boys stared back at him. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The driver slowly turned in a full circle. He studied the quiet creek, the surrounding trees, and the narrow country road before looking back at the three boys. His expression shifted from confusion to genuine concern. He removed his cap and ran a hand through his hair. "Bloody hell, what in God's name?" He looked back toward the bus. Then he looked at the three boys again. His voice was polite but unsteady. "Would one of you mind telling me where I am?" Tommy answered first. "You're in Ash Creek, Ohio." The driver frowned. "Ohio?" Ray nodded. "That's right." The driver blinked several times. Tommy glanced at Eddie. "I think he's even more confused than we are." The driver rubbed the back of his neck. "I just finished my shift. I was taking the bus back to the depot. I entered the Blackwell Tunnel." His eyes drifted toward the bus. Then all of a sudden, this white electrical haze filled the tunnel. I stood on the brakes, but there wasn't room to stop. The bus went straight into it, and when I came out the other side, London was gone. The three boys didn't know what to say. What the boys and the bus driver did not know was that the Blackwell Tunnel had been a place of paranormal activity since its construction in 1897. The public knew it as one of London's oldest road tunnels beneath the River Thames. For more than a century, people had reported things that couldn't be explained. Drivers claimed they entered the tunnel in daylight and emerged beneath a midnight sky. Motorists reported following cars that simply vanished. Some heard children laughing inside the tunnel when no one else was there. Others swore someone had whispered their name from the back seat when they were driving alone. Most people dismissed the stories. The outer agency did not. Every report was investigated. Most proved to be harmless disturbances in the fabric of time. Just small tears and brief overlaps. Moments where yesterday and tomorrow brushed against each other. These were insignificant small anomalies that always healed. But in this instance, for a split second, something inside the Blackwell Tunnel had created a rift too big to ignore. Ray couldn't take his eyes off the strange red bus. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. "Hey mister, can I go inside and see your bus?" The driver looked back at the bus before answering. "I suppose we can." Tommy started toward the door. This time, nobody raced to be first. After everything they just heard, the bus was becoming more intimidating than inviting. Tommy climbed aboard without saying a word. Ray followed a step behind. Eddie reached the bottom step and stopped. Ray looked back. "You coming or what?" Eddie didn't answer. Tommy's voice came from farther inside the bus. "What are you waiting for?" Eddie kept staring into the bus. His fingers tightened around the handrail. For a moment, he simply couldn't climb the last 2 steps. Ray smiled at Eddie. "Don't tell me you're scared." Eddie looked at him. "No." "Then get in here." Eddie loosened his grip on the handrail, climbed the last 2 steps, and the instant both feet touched the floor, the folding door exploded shut. The crack tore through the bus like a rifle fired inside a church. The sound slammed through the empty bus so violently it rattled every window. The driver instinctively reached for the door control lever and pulled it back, but nothing happened. He pushed it forward and then back again. The lever answered with its familiar metallic click, but the folding door never moved. Before anyone found their voice, the engine coughed once, then again before settling into a deep, steady rumble that vibrated through the floor beneath their feet. The driver's eyes dropped to the ignition. He knew the key was still in his pocket. The bus eased forward. He grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and pressed the brake pedal to the floor, but neither answered him. The wheel continued turning with slow, deliberate purpose, and the bus rolled onward as though it had stopped belonging to him. Outside the windows, the trees slowly lost their shape. The road disappeared. Then the year 1940, and Ash Creek, Ohio along with it. Something hazy enveloped the bus. It was not light. It was not darkness. It was something their minds had no name for. The deeper the bus traveled, the harder it became to breathe. Each breath seemed thinner than the last. Their ears filled with a crushing pressure that refused to break. Tommy swallowed again and again. Nothing changed. Ray felt his stomach lurch as though the floor had fallen away beneath him. Eddie reached for the nearest seat because he could no longer tell whether he was standing or falling. The driver tried to speak. He felt the words leave his mouth, though he never heard them. The silence itself seemed to press against them. Time no longer behaved the way it should. A heartbeat seemed to last forever. The next came almost before the first had ended. No one knew whether the bus was moving. No one knew whether it had stopped. No one knew if there was still a world beyond the windows. Then the pressure vanished. Air rushed back into their lungs. Sound returned around them. Color slowly seeped back into the world. First came the brick buildings, then the streetlights, then rows of red buses. The bus rolled through the gates of a London depot, turned neatly into its parking bay, and came to a gentle stop. The engine fell silent. The folding door hissed open. No one moved. The driver stared through the windshield for several long seconds. Finally he spoke. "This is London." Back in the briefing room, Director Sojourn raised one hand. The projection froze. The image of the London bus remained suspended above the briefing table. Sojourn regarded it for a moment. That bus was not an accident. The agency guided it to Ash Creek. We guided it back to London. He let the words settle over the room. Retrieving the boys was only the first phase of this operation. He looked toward the frozen image of Eddie Parker. The second phase begins now. For reasons that will soon become apparent, Edward Parker must hear something that had not yet been created in their year 1940. It is essential that he hear it. He glanced around the room. At first glance, it will seem insignificant. It is most definitely not. The decisions Edward Parker makes decades from now depend upon what he hears in 1979. Pay very close attention. The projection sprang back to life. For several long seconds, no one on the bus moved. The driver was the first to recover. He took a slow breath, stood, and stepped into the aisle. "All right, boys." His voice was steady now. "I don't know how we got here, and I don't know how I'm going to explain any of this to my wife." He looked from one frightened face to the next. "But for now, you're coming home with me. I'll keep you safe. Come with me now and we'll figure this out together." The boys slowly climbed off the bus. The moment Eddie's feet touched the pavement, he doubled over. He barely had time to turn before he vomited beside the curb. The driver was beside him in an instant. He rested a reassuring hand on Eddie's shoulder. "Take your time, son." Tommy stood frozen. Ray looked from Eddie to the driver. Neither boy knew what to do. Eddie wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Tears welled in his eyes. "I want my mom." The driver gently squeezed his shoulder. "I know the feeling." He waited until Eddie finally nodded. "Come on. We've got about a 20-minute walk. My wife will know what to do." The four of them left the depot together. The streets beyond the depot were louder than anything the boys had ever experienced. Engines growled. Air brakes hissed. Car horns blared. Voices overlapped until London itself seemed to have a heartbeat. Red buses rumbled past every few minutes. Black taxis slipped through the traffic. Rows of brick houses stretched block after block. Red telephone boxes stood on busy corners. People hurried past carrying shopping bags and briefcases without giving the strange little group more than a passing glance. One elderly woman smiled as they passed. "What lovely costumes." The boys looked at one another. The driver smiled politely and kept walking. A few minutes later they reached a zebra crossing. Cars rolled to a stop. Tommy stared. "They're stopping for us." The driver nodded. "That's generally how it works." Ray looked both directions before crossing. "They just trust people?" "They trust the crossing." Tommy shook his head. That'd never work back home. The driver laughed quietly. "No, I don't suppose it would." They continued deeper into the neighborhood. A jet roared overhead. All three boys stopped walking. Ray looked almost straight up. "What was that?" The driver smiled. "That is an airplane." Ray frowned. "No airplane flies that fast." The driver thought for a moment before answering. "They do now." They walked another block before the aroma of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixed with the unmistakable scent of hot oil and malt vinegar drifting through the afternoon air. The driver pointed toward a small corner chip shop. "Best fish and chips in the neighborhood." A few minutes minutes later, he stepped back outside carrying 4 steaming parcels wrapped in newspaper. As he handed one to Eddie, the date caught his eye. He stood there for just a moment. He had finally confirmed he was back in 1979. A feeling of relief washed over him. He folded the newspaper over the fish and chips and smiled. "Come on, boys. Let's eat while it's hot." The 4 of them settled onto a low brick wall beside the pavement. For the first time since Ash Creek, nobody felt the need to speak. Tommy took a bite. His eyes widened. "This is the best fish I've ever eaten." Ray copied the driver and splashed vinegar across his chips. He took one bite and nearly coughed. "What is that?" "Malt vinegar." Ray frowned. "I don't think I like it." The driver chuckled. "Most people don't the first time." Tommy reached over. "Let me try." He stole one of Ray's chips. His face twisted. "That ain't for me." "Still, that fish is pretty terrific." The driver laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." Across the street, a teenager leaned against a brick wall with a silver boombox resting beside him. Without warning, an electric guitar ripped through the afternoon traffic. A guitar growled before climbing higher, bending notes that seemed impossible, twisting through the air with effortless confidence before crashing back into a rhythm that somehow felt both wild and perfectly controlled. Nobody noticed Eddie. He had stopped eating. Something inside him had come alive. The music didn't sound like anything he had ever imagined. It wasn't polite. It wasn't careful. It was wild. Every note seemed to push against the rules of everything he thought music was supposed to be. Without realizing it, he had stopped eating altogether. Tommy looked up. "What in the world is that racket?" Ray listened for a second. "Is that supposed to sound like that?" The driver barely looked up from his dinner. "Just one of these youngsters and their music." He unwrapped another chip. The driver noticed Eddie first. "Eddie?" No answer. Tommy nudged him. "You all right?" Eddie never took his eyes off the teenager across the street. "Holy smokes. I love 1979 music." Eddie Parker had just heard Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix for the very first time. As I watched him listening to it, I couldn't help but smile. The first time I heard Purple Haze, I couldn't believe music could sound like that either. Director Sojourn slowly raised one hand. The projection froze. The closing notes of Purple Haze still echoed through the briefing hall. No one spoke. Sojourn allowed the music to fade into silence before he began. "Agents, what you have just witnessed is the true objective of this mission." He rested one hand on the projection table. "Edward Parker will become one of London's most gifted sound engineers. His reputation will eventually bring him into Jimi Hendrix's circle. The two of them will spend years experimenting with sound. The recording the world will come to know as Purple Haze will emerge from that collaboration." Sojourn slowly walked around the projection table. Purple Haze became far more than a soundtrack. Its surreal, dreamlike quality led millions of people to ask a question they had never considered before. What if my mind can experience more than I've been taught? That single question reached far beyond music. It influenced psychology. Philosophy soon followed. Writers, artists, and spiritual movements all embraced the idea. Even social experimentation took inspiration from it. It helped normalize the idea that human consciousness could be expanded, altered, and explored. Sojourn stopped beside the frozen image of Eddie Parker. Edward Parker had to hear that music as a child. He had to experience it before education and reason could explain it away. Only then could he carry that sense of wonder into every recording session that followed. Sojourn looked around the briefing hall. The boys are now safely at the bus driver's home. Arthur and Margaret Wilcox have now witnessed events that cannot remain part of recorded history. In a few moments, you will depart for London. You will meet with all 5 individuals. Your first responsibility is to put them at ease. They have experienced something no one should ever have to experience alone. You will explain only what is necessary. Nothing more. When they understand the situation, each of them must agree to a complete memory wipe. Their memories cannot be allowed to remain. The integrity of the timeline depends upon it. Sojourn turned back toward the frozen image of Eddie Parker. Edward Parker will be the one exception. His memories of these events will be removed. His memory of hearing purple haze will also be removed. The emotional response it created must remain intact. That response is essential to the timeline. Once the memory wipes are complete, all 5 individuals will be returned to the precise moment from which they were removed. Saren lowered his hand. The retrieval operation begins now. None of us moved. Then chairs slid back all around the briefing hall. We returned to our quarters to collect the equipment required for the retrieval. The clothes the agency had selected for London, 1979, were waiting on my bed. A charcoal sports jacket, a pale blue shirt, a narrow tie, dark trousers. Nothing about them would draw a second glance. I changed quickly, fastened my timepiece around my wrist, checked my communicator, then slipped my field scanner and the rest of my equipment into the leather satchel prepared for the era. A few minutes later I met Graham and Ayanna outside the transport chamber. Graham looked down at the brown tweed jacket he'd been issued and frowned. I look like an accountant. Ayanna smiled. You look perfectly ordinary. Graham tugged at his lapel. I was hoping for something with a little more style. You always are, Ayanna replied. Graham sighed. I don't suppose we have time to stop for fish and chips? I looked at him. No. Graham grinned. I thought I'd ask. You always do. The transport chamber doors parted. A circular platform occupied the center of the room. 3 illuminated circles glowed softly on its polished surface. Graham stepped onto one. Ayanna stepped onto another. I took the third. The coordinates had already been programmed. National Portrait Gallery Field Office, London. The technician looked up from the control console. The monitoring team confirms all 5 subjects remain at the residence. Arthur and Margaret Wilcox are with the boys. I nodded once. Initiate transport. The white light rose around us. Even after all those years, transport always unsettled me for the briefest instant. My balance disappeared. My stomach seemed to hesitate. Then the feeling was gone as quickly as it had come. Solid ground returned beneath my feet. I drew a quiet breath. London. We had rematerialized inside the field office beneath the National Portrait Gallery. A man in a dark suit was already waiting beside the transport platform. Agent Hale. I nodded. He handed me a sealed manila envelope. Current British currency. Underground tickets. Folded street map. Your route has been marked. I slipped the envelope into my satchel. Thank you. The station entrance is at the top of the stairs. Follow the marked route. Understood. He stepped aside. That concluded our business. I looked at Graham and Ayanna. Let's go. Together we climbed the stairs toward the streets of London. The Bakerloo line was busy without being overcrowded. We found 3 seats together. At the next station, a man stepped aboard carrying fish and chips. The unmistakable smell of fish and chips drifted through the carriage. I looked at Graham. His eyes never left the fish. Ayanna leaned toward him. Graham, she whispered, control yourself. Without taking his eyes off the meal, Graham answered, I'm exercising remarkable restraint. You've been watching every bite. I'm observing British culture. Ayanna rolled her eyes. The train slowed into the next station. The man finished the last of his chips and stood. As he passed our seats, he stopped in front of Graham, reached into his pocket, and placed a £1 note in Graham's hand. Bloody hell, man. Go get yourself something to eat. And don't stare at people's chips. Before Graham could think of a reply, the doors closed behind the man and the train pulled away. Graham looked down at the note in his hand. I didn't realize I was being that obvious. A recorded voice broke the silence inside the carriage. Charing Cross. Change here for the Jubilee line. That's us, I said. The doors slid open and we stepped onto the platform. A short time later, we emerged from Poplar Station into the warm London afternoon. I checked the address. It isn't far. We had gone less than a block when Ayanna stopped outside a small convenience store. I'll be right back. She disappeared inside. Graham watched the door. A minute later she returned, slipping something into her purse. What was that? Graham asked. A lottery ticket. He looked at her. Planning for retirement? She smiled. You could say that. Before either of us could ask another question, she nodded toward the street ahead. Come on. We have 3 boys to bring home. A few minutes later, I stopped at the gate of a modest brick row house. I checked the number beside the door. It matched. I walked up the short path and pressed the doorbell. The bus driver answered the door. Before he could say a word, Ayana smiled warmly. Mr. Wilcox, I know you've had a very difficult day. His expression changed. We know what happened in the Black Wall Tunnel. We know where you've been. We're here to help you, your wife, and the boys. For several long seconds, Arthur Wilcox simply looked at the 3 of us. Finally, he asked, Who are you people? I answered, My name is Peter Hale. These are my colleagues, Graham McKay and Ayana Redbird. If you'll allow us to come in, we'll explain everything. Then we'll answer every question you have. Arthur didn't answer immediately. 3 strangers stood on his doorstep. They knew about the Black Wall Tunnel. They knew where he'd been. No one outside this house should have known any of it. His first responsibility was to protect the boys. But if these people truly understood what had happened, he owed it to everyone inside the house to hear them. He stepped back from the doorway. Please come in. He closed the door behind us and led us into a modest sitting room. A woman rose from the sofa as we entered. She looked at Arthur before turning her attention to us. Arthur, who are these people? Arthur walked over to her. I don't know yet, Margaret. He looked back at us. But they know about what happened in the Black Wall Tunnel and the day I've had. They said they're here to help. Margaret looked from one of us to the next. I don't believe we've met. I nodded. My name is Peter Hale. These are my colleagues, Graham McKay and Ayana Redbird. This is my wife, Margaret Wilcox, Arthur said. It's nice to meet you, I replied. Margaret managed a polite smile, though the concern never left her face. Only then did I look toward the sofa. Tommy Callahan, Ray Siciliano, Eddie Parker. The 3 boys had been watching us from the moment we entered the room. Tommy looked curious. Ray looked uncertain. Eddie looked exhausted. No one spoke. The room had fallen completely silent. I looked at Arthur and Margaret. I realize everything that's happened today seems impossible. I promise you, there is an explanation. For the next several minutes, I explained what had happened in the Black Wall Tunnel as simply as I could. I told them how a temporary rupture in time had briefly connected London in 1979 to Ash Creek, Ohio in 1940. I explained that my colleagues and I worked for an organization known as the Outer Agency, whose sole purpose was to preserve Earth's timeline. When events threatened history, we were sent to correct them before lasting damage could be done. No one interrupted. Arthur and Margaret listened without taking their eyes off me. The boys listened even harder. When I finished, the room fell silent. Finally, Arthur spoke. So you're telling us time travel is real? Yes. And the 4 of you are responsible for protecting history? That's right. Arthur leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. I can't say I understand all of it. He looked at Margaret, then at the 3 boys. But after what I've seen today, I don't suppose there's any point pretending otherwise. I nodded. I appreciate your keeping an open mind, Mr. Wilcox. He gave a tired smile. I don't know that I've got much choice. Arthur was quiet for a moment. He looked across the room at the 3 boys. What happens to them now? We'll be returning them to the moments just before they saw the bus. Ray frowned. You mean today? Yes. Tommy leaned forward. It'll be like we never left? That's right. It will be as if this never happened. The 3 boys looked at one another. For the first time since we'd arrived, I saw relief replace the uncertainty on their faces. Margaret smiled. Then everything will be put right. Yes, I said. That is our intention. Her smile slowly faded. You said, our intention. Is there something you're not telling us? I nodded. There is one part of the mission you need to understand. Arthur straightened in his chair. What is it? When the boys return to Ash Creek, history must continue exactly as it was meant to. I don't follow. The timeline can only be restored if today's events are erased from everyone's memory. The room fell silent. Margaret looked at me. You mean the boys won't remember today? No. She turned toward Arthur. And we don't get to remember them? No. Arthur looked across the room at Tommy, Ray, and Eddie. The boys looked back at him. None of them spoke. After everything they had shared that afternoon, they had just learned they would soon become strangers again. Tommy looked down at the floor. Ray swallowed hard. Eddie stared quietly at Arthur and Margaret. No one wanted the afternoon to end that way. Yet every one of them understood there wasn't another choice. No one spoke for several long seconds. Then Arthur looked at me. What happens next? We returned the boys to Ash Creek. Arthur looked toward Tommy, Ray, and Eddie. And after that? After that, they continue their lives as they were meant to. Arthur nodded slowly. I understand. He looked at Margaret. She quietly nodded. Then he looked back at me. If that's what it takes to put things right, then we agree. I nodded. Thank you. I looked at Graham. We should go. Everyone stood. The boys and the Wilcoxes looked at one another. No one tried to find the right words. There weren't any. They simply stepped forward and shared warm hugs before the moment passed. Then Graham opened the door. Tommy, Ray, and Eddie followed us out onto the street. Ayana remained behind with Arthur and Margaret. Incidentally, we later learned during the debriefing on Arcturus that the Wilcoxes won enough money from the lottery ticket to retire very comfortably. It was Ayana's quiet way of thanking them for their kindness. We made our way back to the National Portrait Gallery field office. The journey was mostly quiet. The boys were exhausted. About halfway there, Ray finally broke the silence. I really loved the fish and chips. Tommy smiled. That's what you're thinking about? Ray shrugged. I'm hungry again. Even Graham laughed. By the time we reached the transport chamber, the boys looked as though they could have slept for a week. Graham opened the door. The familiar circular platform waited beneath the lights. The three boys stepped inside. Tommy looked around. So this is how we get home? Yes. Ray looked at the platform. Will we feel anything? You may feel slightly dizzy when you arrive. The feeling won't last. Eddie looked at me. Then we'll be back at the creek? Exactly. Graham moved to the control console. The coordinates were set, along with the calculations for the memory wipe. I looked at the three boys. Ready? Tommy nodded. Ray took a deep breath. Eddie smiled. I'm ready to go home. The transport chamber came to life. White light rose around the three boys. The light grew brighter until I could no longer make out their faces. A heartbeat later, it faded. The platform was empty. What would collapse inside each one of us? When one of humanity's defining symbols of courage is erased before it ever exists. Imagine a world where Michelangelo never touches the marble that becomes the David, where the block shatters in a courtyard in Florence, and the young sculptor who should have carved it dies under the rubble. In that world, the Renaissance doesn't ignite the way it's supposed to. Art doesn't push as hard. Power doesn't get questioned as loudly. The idea of what a human being can be, what we can stand for, never reaches the height it does in ours. That collapse didn't happen here. But it did happen in a parallel dimension close enough to our Earth to cause instability. I'm Peter Hale. I'm an active duty time travel agent for the Outer Agency, operating out of Arcturus. So here's what went down. I was in my quarters reviewing mission notes from a previous assignment when the call came through. A soft chime, steady and unmistakable, the sound the Outer Agency uses when duty is not optional. I set the tablet aside and stood, already knowing Graham would be receiving the same alert. Mandatory summons. I set the tablet down and stepped into the corridor. Graham McKay was already heading for the briefing hall, moving with that deliberate, unhurried confidence he never has to announce. Broad-shouldered, built like the highlands that raised him, McKay comes out of the late 1200s and serves as my right hand on most missions. The one man I trust to stand at my side when things turn dangerous. We'd both seen the same report. We both knew what kind of mission starts when a symbol like the David goes missing from history. The briefing hall doors opened as we approached. Ayanna Redbird was already inside, standing near the central projection table. Her long braids were wrapped in red cloth, and the soft lines of her face carried the calm of someone who sees more than she ever says. She nodded once when she saw us. The outer agency's projection grid flickered to life above the table. Thousands of alternate Earths suspended in a lattice of light. One of them pulsed with a dull red glow. Ayanna spoke first. Another collapse. Her voice carried the weight of knowing exactly what that meant. The agency's voice followed, steady, resonant, and clear. Agents Hale, McKay, and Redbird. A critical divergence has occurred on an alternate Earth. The marble block intended for Michelangelo's David was destroyed. The artist was killed in the collapse. The Renaissance failed to ignite. The grid zoomed in on the collapsed timeline. I saw the courtyard of the Opera del Duomo in Florence, the cathedral workshop where the massive marble block had rested for decades. But in this timeline, the block was shattered into jagged pieces. Dust hung in the air, and beneath the rubble lay the unmistakable form of a man whose work would have shaped centuries. Michelangelo Buonarroti. His body lifeless. The agency continued. The destruction was not accidental. A Medici adversary, aligned with Draco reptilian interests, infiltrated the workshop. The enemy is a shapeshifter. Its objective is to prevent the creation of the David, destabilizing cultural evolution across time and space. Graham's jaw tightened. He had no love for shapeshifters. I studied the projection. The marble block, quarried in Carrara, abandoned for 40 years due to imperfections. It was more than stone. It was a watershed moment. Michelangelo's The David would become a symbol of human potential, courage, and identity. Its absence would ripple across centuries. The agency's voice deepened. The enemy has crossed into your Earth's timeline. It is currently operating in Florence, year 1501. Its goal is unchanged. Ayanna stepped closer to the projection, her eyes narrowing. Michelangelo must live, she said softly. The agency confirmed. Agents Hale and McKay will travel to Florence. Redbird will remain until the timeline stabilizes. She will join if Michelangelo is injured. Graham nodded once and we exited the briefing hall. rose around us in the early light, its narrow streets already alive with movement. The portal sealed behind us, leaving only the city and the countdown. 48 hours. That was all we had. Graham checked the pocket watch synced to the destruction timestamp. 47 hours, 53 minutes, he said. We crossed the piazza toward the cathedral workshop. The courtyard behind Santa Maria del Fiore was quiet, save for the scrape of clay under Michelangelo's hands. He didn't notice us at first. He was bent over a small clay torso, shaping the shoulder with slow, deliberate pressure. He stepped back, frowned, leaned in again. His thumb pressed into the rib line, then paused. He muttered to himself, "No, that's not it. Something's missing." He studied the clay from another angle. The strength is there, but the life isn't. He didn't look at us. He didn't ask who we were. He simply returned to the clay, searching for something he couldn't name. That moment mattered. We didn't know how much yet. When he finally noticed us, he wiped his hands on a cloth. "You're the men sent by the guild?" "Yes," I said. "Security." He nodded once, already half back in his work. Michelangelo wasn't the kind of man who wasted attention. The marble block stood upright in the center of the courtyard, towering over everything. Sunlight caught the rough surface, revealing old chisel marks from abandoned attempts decades earlier. Michelangelo gestured toward it without looking away from his clay. "I begin work tomorrow." Tomorrow. The day before the destruction. Graham scanned the courtyard with the quiet focus of someone trained to detect anomalies. Nothing obvious, nothing suspicious, just Florence breathing around us. But the air just felt off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just slightly misaligned, like a room where one object had been moved half an inch. Temporal presence leaves a signature, and Graham felt it too. Michelangelo stepped inside the workshop to fetch a tool. Graham and I remained in the courtyard. A man passed along the far wall. Not close, not lingering, just passing, or so it seemed. He moved with perfect Renaissance poise, but with a precision that didn't belong to the era. His stride was too balanced, his posture too efficient, his gaze too neutral. He didn't look at the block. He didn't look at us. He didn't look at Michelangelo. He looked at nothing. He reached the end of the courtyard and turned behind the scaffolding. There was no exit there. Graham's voice was low. "He didn't come in through the gate." I nodded. "And he didn't leave through it." Michelangelo returned, unaware anything had happened. "What are you watching?" he asked. "Just the courtyard," I said. He accepted that without question. We stayed close to Michelangelo as he worked. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. His focus was absolute. He shaped the clay torso again, then stopped abruptly. "Still wrong," he murmured. "Still missing something." He pressed his thumb into the sternum, then shook his head. "It needs more." He didn't know what more meant. Not yet anyways. We walked the perimeter of the courtyard, studying the angles, the shadows, the scaffolding. The infiltrator wasn't scouting, he was positioning. He needed a moment alone with the block. We needed to make sure he never got it. Inside the cathedral, the air felt heavier, not ominous, just dense with centuries of prayer and stone. We walked the nave quietly, scanning the edges of the space. A faint smell of ozone drifted near the side chapel. Graham touched the stone wall. "Temporal residue," he murmured. "Someone had been here recently. Someone not from this century." Michelangelo was focused on his work. He didn't see the danger. He didn't need to. That was our job. We returned to the courtyard. Michelangelo stood beside the block, studying it with a sculptor's intensity. He didn't see the infiltrator. He didn't sense the temporal residue. He didn't notice the wrongness in the air. But he felt something. He looked at me. "If someone intends to strike," he said quietly, "they will do it soon?" I nodded. "Yes." He looked at the block again. Then we watch. Graham stepped beside him. We watch. Michelangelo accepted that without question. He didn't know how close the danger was. He didn't know how much depended on the next 44 hours. He didn't know the spark of inspiration he was searching for in clay would arrive in the most impossible way. But he would very soon. Evening settled over Florence with surprising gentleness. The last warmth of the sun lingered against the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, turning the stone a deep shade of amber before surrendering to twilight. Shopkeepers drew in their signs. Bakers carried fresh loaves from glowing ovens. The fragrance of warm bread drifted through the narrow streets, mingling with the sharper scent of cut marble and damp limestone. For a few precious moments, the city seemed untouched by danger. It was almost enough to make me forget why we were there. Michelangelo did not share the city's peace. He stood before the clay figure with his arms folded tightly across his chest, studying it from every angle. He circled it once, then again. He reached forward and reshaped the shoulder with careful fingers before stepping back. His expression darkened. "No," he exclaimed. He flattened the shoulder with the side of his hand. Again he sculpted. Again he stepped back. Again he frowned. Graham leaned quietly against a stone pillar, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that creative frustration was not something to interrupt. Neither had I. Michelangelo worked another quarter hour before suddenly driving both hands into the clay. The torso collapsed beneath his palms. "Dio mio," he muttered. He closed his eyes. "I know every muscle." His voice was almost a whisper now. "I know every tendon." He pressed his fingertips against the ruined figure. "I know the skeleton beneath the flesh." He looked at us, frustration giving way to exhaustion. "So why?" He searched for the words. "Does it still refuse to live?" Neither Graham nor I answered. I wasn't sure there was an answer anyone could give. Michelangelo paced the workshop. "I have studied corpses." He spoke matter-of-factly as though discussing weather. "I have measured shoulders. I have studied hips, knees, and hands." He held up his own. "I know exactly how the human body is built." He looked back at the ruined clay. "But knowledge is not enough." He struck the work table with the side of his fist. "There is something else." His eyes lifted toward the towering marble block waiting patiently in the courtyard. "I simply cannot see it." The silence stretched. Outside, the cathedral bells marked the passing hour. Michelangelo removed his apron with an irritated tug and threw it onto a bench. "If I remain here another minute," he sighed heavily, "I shall begin arguing with the stone." That earned the faintest smile from Graham. Michelangelo noticed. "You laugh." "I've known about stubborn stone before," Graham replied. Michelangelo studied him. "You've worked quarries?" "Aye." The answer was simple. Nothing more. Michelangelo seemed unexpectedly pleased. "Then you understand." "I understand that stone wins arguments." And for the first time all day, Michelangelo laughed. It was brief. It was warm and entirely genuine. "You are wiser than most sculptors." He reached for his cloak. "I require wine." He fastened it around his shoulders. "And perhaps terrible music." He pointed toward the clay. "Do not touch it." Then toward the marble. "And certainly do not touch that." "We'll see it remains untouched," I assured him. "I hope so." He pulled open the workshop door. "If inspiration chooses to arrive while I'm gone." He smiled tiredly. "Tell it I'll return shortly." Then he disappeared into the evening streets. The courtyard became remarkably still. The kind of stillness that allows a person to notice things usually overlooked. A pigeon landing on the cathedral roof. The distant rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer. The soft scrape of leaves carried across ancient stone by a cooling breeze. Graham slowly crossed to the marble block. He placed one weathered hand against its rough surface. "It almost feels warm. The sun held it all afternoon," I said. He nodded thoughtfully. "No." He looked at me. "I don't mean from the sun." I walked over beside him. The marble was cool beneath my fingertips, but there was something difficult to describe. Not warmth, potential, as though the stone itself were waiting. I understand him now, I said quietly. Who? Michelangelo. Graham glanced back toward the abandoned clay model. He isn't trying to carve a man. He's trying to carve an idea. The Scotsman considered that a difficult thing to do. He replied, the hardest. We stood in silence. The marble towered above us like a sleeping giant. It had waited nearly 40 years for the right sculptor. It could wait one more night. A cart rattled past beyond the courtyard wall. Voices drifted from nearby taverns. Someone laughed. Then another sound reached us. It was soft, almost too soft to notice. We heard the faint sound of footsteps. Not hurried, not cautious, measured footsteps. I looked toward the entrance. A Dominican friar crossed the courtyard carrying a bundle wrapped in linen. His head remained bowed. His pace never changed. He acknowledged neither Graham nor me. He walked directly toward the opposite gate, and halfway across, he stumbled. The bundle slipped. For an instant the cloth fell away. Inside lay ordinary mason's tools. A hammer, chisels, and wooden mallet. Nothing unusual. The friar apologized quietly, gathered his things, continued on his way. The gate closed behind him. Graham waited another few seconds before speaking. That wasn't a friar. I know, I responded. The shoes. I nodded. Dominican monks wore simple sandals. The man who had crossed our courtyard had been wearing finely stitched leather boots beneath his robe. Small detail, easy to miss, unless you had spent years noticing details that kept people alive. We followed the friar immediately. The street outside was crowded. Children chased one another between wagons. Women bargained loudly over vegetables. Laborers carried timber toward the cathedral. The friar had vanished. Impossible. The nearest corner was too far away. There had not been enough time. Graham looked both directions. Nothing. I crouched near the street. Fresh dust still floated in the air. Then I saw it. A single footprint. Too deep. As though whoever made it had suddenly become far heavier than an ordinary man. Indication of a temporal transition. The disguise had changed. He had shifted identities. He knows we're watching. Graham's eyes swept across the crowd. Or he wanted us to follow. Neither possibility was comforting. The remainder of the evening passed without incident. We took turns watching the courtyard while workers gradually departed for the night. One by one the lanterns surrounding the workshop were lit. Long shadows stretched across the stone. The marble block seemed almost luminous beneath the flickering light. Near midnight, the foreman arrived. He was an elderly mason named Bernardo, broad-shouldered despite his years. He frowned when he found us still awake. You fellows intend to stand here until sunrise? If necessary, Graham responded. He chuckled. Nothing ever happens here. Graham and I exchanged a glance. History had an unfortunate habit of proving statements like that wrong. Bernardo rested one hand against the marble. My father worked this block. He smiled wistfully. He said it was cursed. Cursed, you say? I asked. So many failures. He nodded toward the towering stone. 2 sculptors abandoned it. He ran rough fingers over an old chisel scar. Others refused it, and his smile faded. Sometimes I wonder whether the stone chooses its own master. I looked toward the cathedral. Or perhaps someone had spent decades ensuring no one succeeded. The thought lingered longer than I liked. The bells rang at midnight and everything became quiet. Far too quiet. Even the pigeons nesting beneath the cathedral roof fell silent. Graham slowly straightened. You feel it? I do, I replied. The air itself seemed heavier, not threatening. Somewhere beyond the lantern light, someone else had entered the courtyard. We couldn't see him, not just yet, but we were no longer alone. No one moved. The silence that had settled over the courtyard no longer belonged to Florence. It belonged to something else. Something was watching us. Graham slowly loosened the leather strap that secured the short axe concealed beneath his cloak. He did not draw it. He merely rested his hand where it could find the handle without looking. "I count 3 lanterns," Graham said quietly. "I know," I replied. "Too many shadows." "I know." A cool breeze drifted through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Yet the evening sky remained perfectly clear. The strange feeling lingered for perhaps 20 seconds and then it was gone. The air lightened. The pigeons returned to their restless murmuring beneath the cathedral roof. Somewhere beyond the walls, a dog barked twice before settling again. Whatever had been watching us had left, or wanted us to believe it had. "We're being measured," Graham observed. I nodded slowly. "He isn't looking for an opening," I said. "What then?" Graham asked, turning toward me. "He's learning." Graham frowned. "Learning what?" "How we move," I answered. The realization settled heavily between us. Every encounter, every glimpse, every disappearance. The infiltrator had never truly tried to kill us. Not once. He had been studying us, learning our habits, our routines. The eastern sky had only begun to pale when the first workers returned. Stone cutters and apprentices. Laborers balancing heavy beams across broad shoulders. Soon the familiar sounds of the workshop returned. Hammers and voices. The scrape of chisels against limestone. Normal life. Exactly what the enemy wanted to hide within. Michelangelo arrived just after sunrise carrying an unfinished loaf of bread beneath one arm. He looked surprisingly refreshed. "I have solved nothing," Michelangelo announced with a weary smile. "But at least I no longer dislike everyone." Even Graham allowed himself the hint of a smile. Michelangelo noticed. "You've been awake all night," he said, studying our faces. "We have," I replied. "You found something?" "We found questions." Michelangelo sighed. "I was hoping for answers," he admitted. "So were we," I said quietly. Without another word, Michelangelo walked directly toward the great marble block. For several long moments he simply stood before it. Then he rested one hand against the cool stone. His expression softened. "I know you are in there," he whispered to the marble. "I only need to find you." His fingertips traced an old scar left by another sculptor decades before. "So many men believed you were ruined," Michelangelo murmured. A faint smile crossed his face. "They were wrong." He stood another minute before turning back toward the workshop. "Come with me," he called to us. "You've decided?" I asked. "No," Michelangelo answered with a small laugh. "But I will begin anyway." The first strike of Michelangelo's hammer echoed across the courtyard like another cathedral bell. Not hard nor dramatic. It was measured and almost respectful. Tiny fragments of marble drifted downward into the morning light. Michelangelo stopped. He studied the surface carefully. He shifted his footing, then struck again. Watching him work was unlike watching any craftsman I had ever known. Nothing was hurried. Every movement seemed to begin long before his hands actually moved. It was as though he carved with thought first, and tools second. By midday, nearly a dozen apprentices had gathered to watch. Some whispered admiration. Others whispered doubt. One young sculptor leaned toward his companion. "He'll split the stone within a week," the apprentice muttered confidently. Michelangelo pretended not to hear. A distinguished sculptor from another workshop entered the courtyard. His expensive robes announced success long before he spoke. He circled the marble once, then again. Finally he smiled with carefully disguised amusement. "So tell me, Michelangelo," the older sculptor began. "You truly accepted the giant?" Michelangelo continued working without looking up. "I did," he replied calmly. "A curious decision," the visitor said. Still Michelangelo kept carving. "The flaws remain." "I know that," Michelangelo answered. "The grain twists." "I know it. The left side is weak." "I know that as well, fine sir." The proportions can never be corrected. This time Michelangelo lowered his hammer. He turned slowly toward the older man. "I know every flaw in this stone," he said evenly. The visitor folded his arms. "Then why accept the commission?" he asked. Michelangelo rested one hand against the marble. "Because everyone else saw only the damage," he replied. He gently brushed marble dust from the surface. "I see the man." The courtyard fell silent. Even the older sculptor seemed unable to answer. After a long moment he smiled politely. "You're either a genius," he said, "or completely mad." Michelangelo smiled for the first time that morning. "Those are not always different things," he replied. Graham chuckled softly beside me. The older sculptor gathered his robes and departed without another word. His apprentices hurried after him, casting one last doubtful glance toward the towering block of marble before disappearing into the streets. The courtyard gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Hammers rang against stone. Wooden carts creaked beneath heavy loads. Somewhere beyond the workshop wall, a bell announced the noon hour. Michelangelo scarcely noticed. He had entered that curious state where the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. I watched him work for another hour. He rarely struck the marble more than twice before stepping back to study it. Sometimes he closed one eye, sometimes both. Once he circled the block 3 complete times without lifting his hammer again, and it occurred to me that he wasn't carving stone. He was listening to it. Graham wandered slowly around the perimeter of the courtyard, never appearing to patrol. That was one of his greatest strengths. He never looked like a guard. He looked like a laborer stretching his legs. His eyes, however, never stopped moving. When he finally returned, he stood beside me without taking his attention from the gate. "Something's wrong," Graham said quietly. "I've been thinking the same thing," I replied. "It's too busy." I nodded. "There have been more visitors today than workers. And none of them stay." We watched another well-dressed gentleman step through the entrance. He exchanged a few polite words with one of the apprentices, glanced toward Michelangelo's work, then continued through the courtyard without the slightest interest in anything else. 30 seconds later, he was gone. Graham frowned. "That's the 8th. I counted 9. He looked at me. "You saw another?" The man dressed as a monk. Recognition crossed Graham's face. I'd nearly forgotten him. Our attention shifted toward Bernardo. The old mason was organizing chisels beneath a covered workbench. I walked over. "Busy day," I said. Bernardo looked up and smiled. "Busier than I've seen in years," he replied. "The guild has become remarkably interested in our work." "Does that happen often?" I inquired. Bernardo laughed softly. "Never." He selected another chisel and examined its edge against the light. "I've worked in this yard for 23 years. He shook his head. "I've never seen so many officials visit a single project." "Did they all belong to the guild?" The old mason hesitated. "Now that you mention it." He looked thoughtfully toward the gate. "No. Some introduced themselves. Others didn't. And one," he frowned, "asked very strange questions." "What kind of questions?" I replied. Bernardo lowered his voice. He wanted to know who remained in the courtyard after sunset. My pulse quickened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Bernardo shrugged. "Usually no one." He looked toward Graham. "But now," he smiled, "both of you stand guard." I thanked him and returned to Graham. "He knows we'll be here tonight," I said quietly. Graham nodded once. "Good." I looked at him. "You think that's good?" "If he expects us." A faint smile appeared beneath Graham's beard. "He will find that we will be expecting him as well." The afternoon passed without incident. Twice Michelangelo discarded perfectly good chisels because they felt wrong. One apprentice accidentally dropped a heavy mallet from the scaffolding. Another insisted someone had moved his measuring cords. A wheel came loose from a supply cart for no apparent reason. Each event seemed ordinary. Each could be explained away. Yet together they formed a pattern. Small disturbances, tiny disruptions, never enough to stop the work, just enough to erode confidence. I found Michelangelo studying the damaged wheel while the laborers repaired it. Bad luck? I asked. Michelangelo didn't answer immediately. Finally he looked at me. I don't believe in luck, he replied. What do you believe? He looked toward the marble. I believe every problem has a cause. He brushed stone dust from his sleeves. The challenge is discovering it. He smiled faintly. His words lingered in my mind long after we resumed our watch. As evening approached, the workers departed one by one. The noise of the workshop slowly faded until only 4 people remained. Michelangelo, Graham, myself, and Bernardo. The old mason collected his lantern. I'll return before sunrise, he said. Michelangelo finally looked away from the marble. Get some rest, my friend, he told him. Bernardo nodded respectfully. You should do the same. Michelangelo smiled without humor. He gestured toward the unfinished figure emerging from the stone. I will once he allows me. The old mason laughed. I suspect he'll keep you awake for weeks. I suspect you're right. Bernardo disappeared through the gate. The heavy wooden door closed behind him. Its echo rolled across the empty courtyard. Then we were alone. The first stars appeared above Florence. Lantern light flickered across the rough face of the marble, causing shadows to drift slowly across its unfinished surface. Michelangelo lowered himself onto a weathered wooden stool. He rubbed the ache from his hands before finally breaking the silence. May I ask you both something? Michelangelo said quietly. Of course, I replied. Michelangelo looked first at Graham, then at me. You've both seen soldiers. We have, I answered. Many soldiers? Far more than either of us ever wished. Michelangelo nodded thoughtfully. He rested both hands upon the handle of his hammer. Tell me this. His voice became almost reflective. What does a man look like the moment before he decides not to run? The question lingered between us. Finally, Graham answered. He is quiet, he said softly. Michelangelo lifted his eyes. Quiet, he repeated. Graham nodded. The shouting comes afterward. He looked toward the cathedral towers silhouetted against the evening sky. Before the battle, he paused. A man remembers why he's there. He thinks of home. He remembers the people depending on him and steadies his breathing. He accepts what may come. Graham's voice remained calm. There comes a moment when fear is still present, but it no longer makes the decision. Michelangelo listened without moving. And courage? He asked almost in a whisper. Graham smiled faintly. Courage isn't something a man feels. It is something he chooses. Silence settled over the courtyard once again. Michelangelo slowly rose to his feet. Without another word, he crossed to the marble. He rested one hand against its cool surface. His fingers drifted across the stone as though searching for a face only he could see. Almost unconsciously, Michelangelo shifted his weight onto one leg. His shoulders relaxed. His head turned ever so slightly. I recognized the pose immediately. Michelangelo did not. But something inside him had changed. For the first time, he wasn't searching for the perfect body. He was searching for that defining moment. The moment when resolve overcomes fear. A raven cried somewhere above the cathedral. Graham's expression changed instantly. He looked toward the rooftops. I followed his gaze. A solitary figure stood along the ridge of a neighboring building, perfectly motionless, watching us, watching Michelangelo, watching the marble. The man's expensive cloak fluttered gently in the evening breeze. To anyone else, he would have appeared to be nothing more than another wealthy Florentine enjoying the cool air before nightfall. But I knew better. The shapeshifter had chosen another face. Even at this distance, there was something unsettling about him. He stood too still and balanced, like a predator conserving its strength. Neither Graham nor I spoke. We simply watched. After a long moment, the stranger slowly raised one gloved hand. Not in greeting, not in farewell. It felt more like an acknowledgement, as though he wished us to understand that he knew exactly who we were. Then he stepped backward into the darkness beyond the roofline, and he was gone. Graham kept his eyes fixed on the empty rooftop. "He's finished studying us," Graham said quietly. "I believe you're right," I replied. "What now?" Graham asked. I looked toward Michelangelo, who still stood before the marble, completely unaware that history itself was being hunted. Our adversary has changed tactics. He no longer wants to discourage Michelangelo. Graham looked back toward the empty rooftop. "He intends to end this." I nodded. The evening bells began to ring across Florence. Somewhere in the growing darkness, our unseen hunter was already making his final preparations. And for the first time since arriving in Florence, I had the unmistakable feeling that tomorrow we would not walk away unchanged. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. The brilliant Tuscan sunlight that had greeted us the day before was gone, replaced by a cool breeze that carried the scent of rain through the streets of Florence. It was the kind of morning that encouraged people to hurry, to keep their heads down, to notice less than they otherwise might. I couldn't help wondering if our enemy had chosen it for precisely that reason. Graham stood beside the courtyard gate, watching the city awaken. "The weather is changing," he said quietly. I joined him. "So is something else," I replied. "We're running out of time." Neither of us needed to check the agency chronometer. We both knew. Less than 24 hours remained before the moment history had nearly unraveled. Michelangelo arrived carrying 2 bundles wrapped in cloth. One contained fresh bread. The other contained new chisels. He looked from Graham to me before setting them on the workbench. "You both have the same expression," Michelangelo observed. "What expression?" I asked. "The one that men wear when they know trouble is coming." Graham smiled faintly. We do." Michelangelo nodded. "My father had that look." He paused. "So did the soldiers who marched through Florence when I was a boy." He unwrapped the chisels one by one, inspecting each edge with a craftsman's eye. He selected the smallest. The day's work began. Michelangelo lifted the hammer and brought it down. He paused to feel the moment. He studied the surface in front of him. He brought the hammer down once more. He paused again. He was listening to the stone as if waiting for guidance. Every strike echoed across the courtyard with measured precision. Slowly and almost imperceptibly, the broad outline of a man began emerging from the stone. First the start of shoulders, the suggestion of a rib cage, the gentle turn of a hip. Nothing was finished. Everything was becoming. By mid-morning, visitors once again drifted through the workshop. A spice merchant, 2 Dominican priests, a courier carrying sealed documents, a woman delivering linen. Each remained only moments. Each looked toward the marble. Each continued on. To everyone else, they were ordinary Florentines. To me, they had become people of question. "I don't like this," I said quietly as another visitor departed. Graham never looked away from the gate. "Neither do I. They're too comfortable." His eyes followed a young apprentice sweeping marble dust. "They know no one suspects them." I watched the street beyond the wall. Or perhaps. I hesitated. "They aren't all against us." That caught Graham's attention. He turned toward me. "What are you thinking? If you wanted to watch someone, would you become 10 different people?" I said. Graham considered it. "No, I'd become one. And use everyone else without them knowing." The realization settled over both of us. The Draco agent wasn't disguising himself as every passerby. He was influencing ordinary people, turning an entire city into his eyes. Bernardo hurried into the courtyard carrying a rolled parchment beneath his arm. He looked troubled. "Michelangelo," he called. The sculptor lowered his hammer. "What is it?" "The guild." Bernardo handed him the sealed document. "They've ordered another inspection." Michelangelo frowned. "They inspected only yesterday." "I know." He broke the wax seal, his expression darkening as he read. "They want the work stopped." Graham and I exchanged a quick glance. "For how long?" I asked. Michelangelo looked up. "They haven't decided." The sculptor folded the parchment carefully. "They're questioning whether the marble is safe." Bernardo shook his head in disbelief. "They have never questioned it before today." Michelangelo looked toward the towering block. "Now they are." "I'll speak with them," Bernardo offered. Michelangelo smiled gratefully. "You've already done enough." The old mason shook his head. He placed a reassuring hand on Michelangelo's shoulder. "This stone has waited 40 years. He smiled. "It can wait another day." Michelangelo looked down at the parchment. His voice was calm. "No, it has waited long enough." Without another word, he folded the order, then tucked it into his belt, picked up his hammer, and resumed carving. I found myself smiling. Graham noticed. "What?" "I finally understand him." "The sculptor?" I nodded. "He isn't stubborn." "What is he then?" I watched Michelangelo strike the marble once more. "He simply refuses to let fear make his decisions." Graham looked thoughtfully toward the unfinished figure. I believe that's true." The afternoon passed peacefully. Too peacefully. Even the pigeons seemed reluctant to disturb the quiet. Then, without warning, a sharp crack echoed through the courtyard. Everyone turned to look. One of the upper scaffold supports had splintered. The heavy wooden platform lurched violently. A laborer cried out. The entire structure began tipping toward the marble, toward Michelangelo. I shouted for everyone to move. Michelangelo looked up. For one frozen heartbeat. He didn't move at all. The enormous scaffolding groaned. Timbers snapped. A rain of tools crashed toward the courtyard. Graham was already running toward it. He slammed into Michelangelo with enough force to throw them both clear as the scaffolding crashed onto the stone pavement behind them. The impact thundered through the workshop. Dust exploded into the air. Workers screamed. For several terrifying seconds, no one could see anything. When the dust finally began to settle, Michelangelo pushed himself onto one elbow. His eyes searched frantically. "Graham." The Scotsman slowly sat up nearby, rubbing one shoulder. "I'm still here," he answered with a grim smile. Michelangelo stared at the shattered scaffold, then back at Graham. His voice caught. "You ran straight into the collapse." Graham shrugged as though nothing remarkable had happened. "It seemed the quickest way." "The quickest way?" Michelangelo repeated in disbelief. "You could have been killed." Graham brushed dust from his sleeves. "So could you." The sculptor looked at him for a very long moment. No one spoke. The workers slowly began clearing broken timber. Bernardo organized the apprentices. Voices returned to the courtyard. But Michelangelo never took his eyes off Graham. He wasn't looking at his strength. He wasn't studying his shoulders. He wasn't admiring the muscles beneath his tunic. He was trying to understand why another man would instinctively risk his own life for someone he had met only 2 days before. And for the first time, I believed Michelangelo had begun to see the David. The marble block had escaped any injury. The scaffold was rebuilt before sunset. No one spoke very much while they worked. The apprentices lifted fresh timbers into place. Bernardo inspected every joint himself, running his calloused fingers over each peg and brace as though daring the wood to betray him again. No one mentioned sabotage. No one mentioned murder. Yet every man in the courtyard understood that the day had come far too close to ending in tragedy. Michelangelo resumed his work just before the evening bells. The hammer rose, then fell. A single measured strike echoed through the courtyard. He stepped back, studied the marble, then lowered the hammer again without striking. Something had changed. He was no longer carving to discover the figure. He was carving to reveal it. I found Graham replacing the broken straps on his satchel beneath the tool shed awning. "How's your shoulder?" I asked. He flexed his arm once before answering. I intend to complain about it tomorrow. I've seen you take lighter blows that kept you in bed for a week. He smiled. I must be getting old. I laughed quietly. I was going to say stubborn. They're much the same thing. For a few precious moments, we allowed ourselves to believe the danger had passed. That was our mistake. Bernardo approached carrying a small wooden box. I found this beneath the scaffold, he said. He handed it to me. It was beautifully made. Walnut, brass hinges, no markings. I opened the lid. Inside lay 6 ordinary iron nails. Nothing more. I looked at Bernardo. Where exactly did you find it? Wedged beneath one of the support beams. Graham stepped closer. May I? I handed him the box. He turned one of the nails between his fingers, then another. Finally, he held one close to his nose. His expression changed. These aren't from Florence. How can you tell? I asked. The smell. I frowned. The oil. He held the nail toward me. I caught it immediately. Not linseed oil. Not animal fat. It carried the faint metallic scent of synthetic lubricant. Far too modern. Someone had planted the box. Not to help sabotage the scaffold, but to see if anyone would recognize it. Our unseen adversary wasn't merely trying to destroy history anymore. He was testing us. He knows we're investigators, I said quietly. Graham nodded. And now he knows we're observant. Neither thought was comforting. Michelangelo wandered over, wiping marble dust from his hands. You both look as though you've discovered another mystery, he said. We may have, I replied, closing the box. He glanced at it. Should I ask? I smiled. Not this time. He looked toward the marble. I have enough puzzles already. The sculptor stood silently before the unfinished figure. I think I understand something now, he said after several moments. Neither Graham nor I interrupted. I've spent years studying strength. He rested his hand against the stone. Strength is easy. He looked down at his own hands. Any butcher understands muscle. His voice grew quieter. But greatness. He searched for the word. Greatness begins before the first movement. He turned toward Graham. When you pushed me clear of the scaffold. Graham looked uncomfortable. I wasn't thinking. Michelangelo smiled gently. Exactly. He tapped one finger against the marble. Whatever this young shepherd felt before facing Goliath, it wasn't confidence. He looked thoughtfully into the gathering dusk. And it was not certainty. It was something quieter. Graham nodded. I think so. Michelangelo smiled. I've been trying to carve victory. He shook his head. I should have been sculpting decision. The cathedral bells announced the evening prayer. Across Florence, merchants closed their shops. Lanterns appeared one by one in the narrow streets. Children disappeared indoors. The city slowed, but not enough to hide what happened next. A woman entered the courtyard carrying a basket of bread. No one paid her much attention. She greeted Bernardo warmly. She smiled at Michelangelo. She crossed the yard at an unhurried pace, perfectly ordinary. Then she stumbled. The basket struck the ground. Loaves scattered across the stone. Half a dozen apprentices rushed to help. Bernardo bent to gather the bread. Michelangelo stepped forward. Even Graham moved instinctively. For perhaps 3 seconds, every eye in the courtyard was fixed on the fallen basket. Except mine. I never looked away from the marble, and that's when I saw him. The man behind the marble. He had been there the entire time, perfectly still, hidden in the deepening shadows. He had been watching me. Our eyes met. He smiled, not with triumph, with recognition. Then, before I could move, he stepped backward into the darkness beyond the workshop wall, and vanished. I called for Graham quietly. He looked up immediately. What is it? He was here. Graham's expression hardened. I pointed toward the empty shadows behind the marble. He's been watching us. Bernardo looked up in confusion. Who's watching you? I looked at Michelangelo, then back toward the empty darkness. No one you'll ever want to meet. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Graham. The shapeshifter had been close enough for us to look directly into each other's eyes. He wanted us to know that. He wanted us to wonder whether he had already anticipated our every move. Predators often reveal themselves before the final attack, not from arrogance but from confidence. The streets of Florence were unusually still before dawn. A light mist drifted over the Arno River, softening the outlines of bridges and church towers until the city seemed half-remembered rather than fully awake. Somewhere nearby, a baker opened his oven. The smell of fresh bread floated through the cool morning air. Ordinary life continued, completely unaware that history stood balanced upon a single block of marble. The great courtyard lay empty. Only the unfinished marble stood waiting beneath the fading stars. I rested my hand against the stone. So much depends on you. I spoke to the stone. I've known people with less responsibility. Graham replied with a faint smile. I laughed quietly. So have I. Michelangelo arrived moments later carrying nothing except his hammer. He looked rested and calm, more at peace than I had seen him since arriving in Florence. You found something, I said. He smiled. He rested his hand upon the marble. Actually, it found me. I wasn't sure what he meant. Perhaps he wasn't either, but I believed him. Without another word, he lifted the hammer. The sound that followed seemed different from every strike before it. Not louder, more certain. Each blow removed only the smallest fragment of stone. Yet every fragment revealed purpose. Watching him now, I realized he no longer hesitated. He wasn't searching. He had begun revealing the man he had already seen in his mind. Bernardo entered carrying a lantern. You have visitors, he called from the gate. 3 officials from the Wool Guild crossed the courtyard. Their robes were immaculate. They wore severe expressions. The eldest stepped forward. Master Buonarroti. Michelangelo lowered his hammer. Good morning. The guild has reached its decision. Bernardo's shoulders stiffened. So soon? He asked. The official ignored him. The commission is suspended. Silence settled across the courtyard. For what reason? Michelangelo asked calmly. The marble is unsuitable. Michelangelo smiled ever so slightly. Yesterday you believed otherwise. Yesterday is gone. The decision is final. I studied the 3 men. Their faces betrayed nothing. Yet one detail caught my attention. None of them looked at Michelangelo. Their eyes never left the marble. The shapeshifter wasn't among them. The attack had never been physical alone. It was political, convinced the guild to abandon the commission, and history would unravel without a single weapon being drawn. Michelangelo stepped forward. With surprising gentleness, he placed his hammer on the workbench. I've listened respectfully, he said. Now you'll listen to me. Even the officials seemed surprised. This marble has been abandoned for 40 years. He rested one hand against its weathered surface, not because it lacked promise. He looked each man in the eye, but because men lacked courage. The eldest official frowned. Mind your words. Michelangelo's voice never rose. You fear failure. You fear ridicule. You fear spending Florence's money on what others have already called ruined. He smiled. I fear only leaving greatness trapped inside this stone. The courtyard fell silent. Bernardo stared openly. The apprentices had stopped working altogether. Even the officials seemed uncertain how to answer. Finally, the eldest sighed. You are a difficult man. So I've been told. A reluctant smile crossed the official's face. He looked at the others, then back at Michelangelo. The guild withdraws its objection. Relief washed over the courtyard. Bernardo laughed aloud. The apprentices erupted in quiet celebration. Michelangelo simply nodded. "Thank you." Then he picked up his hammer and returned to work. Graham leaned toward me. That wasn't the attack. No, it was the distraction. I had reached the same conclusion. If I had learned anything about our unseen adversary, it was that he preferred people to look the wrong way. A single pigeon burst from the cathedral roof, then another, then dozens. They rose all at once, a gray cloud exploding into the morning sky. Every instinct I possessed came alive. "Graham!" I shouted. He turned instantly. The shapeshifter was already moving. Not from the gate, not from the rooftops, from beneath the scaffold. He had hidden there before dawn. His borrowed face peeled away like melting wax. Green scales caught the morning light. Amber eyes fixed on the marble. In his hands rested the same strange device we had seen before. Not aimed at Michelangelo, aimed at the base of the statue. One pulse would fracture the marble from within. "No!" I shouted. The creature activated the device. A brilliant blue light erupted across the courtyard. Time itself seemed to hesitate. The air shimmered. Stone vibrated. And without hesitation, Graham stepped directly into the path of the pulse. The blast struck him squarely in the chest. He staggered, dropped to one knee, but he did not fall. Instead, he planted one hand against the marble, holding himself upright, protecting it. The shapeshifter stared in disbelief. "Why?" the creature hissed. Graham looked up slowly. His breathing was heavy. His shoulder trembled. Then he answered with the simplest words I had ever heard him speak. "Because some things," he drew another breath, "must endure." Everything stopped, even Michelangelo. His hammer slipped quietly from his hand. He wasn't looking at Graham's strength. He wasn't looking at the creature. He wasn't even looking at the marble. He was watching one ordinary man, choosing to stand, when every instinct must have begged him to fall. I saw it happen, not in the stone, in Michelangelo's eyes. He had found David, not the shepherd, not the hero, the decision, the instant before action, the moment courage defeated fear. I raised my agency emitter. One precise pulse struck the alien device. It shattered into a shower of blue crystal. The shapeshifter recoiled. Its mission had failed. For a heartbeat, our eyes met across the courtyard. There was no hatred in its expression now, only frustration. "You preserve one victory," it snarled. "There are countless others." I raised my weapon once again and obliterated him. The courtyard became still once more. Michelangelo crossed slowly to Graham. He placed one hand on the Scotsman's shoulder. "I have spent years searching for perfection," he said softly. He smiled. "I was searching in the wrong place." He turned toward the marble. "I do not need a perfect man." His hand rested gently against the stone. "I need a true one." Years later, the world would stand before David and marvel at its beauty. They would study the muscles, the absolute balance, the impossible mastery of marble. Few would realize what they were truly seeing. Not victory, not power, but a quiet moment, when an ordinary young shepherd had already made his choice. They would never know that another ordinary man, a quiet Scotsman named Graham Mackay, had helped history remember what courage looked like. And perhaps that was as it should be. The greatest guardians of history are the ones history never records.